evening. America has, in the past several years, sat by their TV and watched many stories unfold in the media dealing with violence against women and sexual assault. These stories range from college universities, from Hollywood, even Congress and the White House has gotten involved. I'm attorney Delia Parker-Mims, and you're watching Access to Justice. Today, we're going to answer the question that was posed by Time magazine, or rather, we're going to discuss it. And that is whether or not we live in a rape culture society, or is it time to get rid of the rape hysteria? Now, to better understand this issue, we have with us two experts from Denton County who are very familiar with the issue of sexual assault and violence against women. First, we'll be talking with Tammy Terrell, who is a therapist and has her own agency, Terrell Counseling, and has had it since 2006. But you've been a counselor a little bit longer than that, is that correct?
Yes, since 1998 I got my license and have been working in the community since, and the academic environment.
And you're also familiar with dealing with people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's one of the things that you do in Terrell Counseling. Is that
yes,
correct?
Delia. Yes, anywhere from working with our military and some of the issues that they deal with, both on base and in my office, as well as those that have been assaulted, traumatized in one way or the other.
Okay. And also with us is Muro, and she is a victim advocate from Denton County Friends of the Family. Mona has been working with victims for at least 7 years and possibly a little bit longer, and she has quite a few specialties in the area of victim representation. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Mona.
Yeah, the area that I specialize in is typically related to the criminal justice system, so victims who are seeking remedies like protective orders to keep themselves physically safe from a perpetrator, if they've been a victim of sexual assault or family violence, also helping them navigate through working with law enforcement, cooperating or testifying if they've been a victim, through those criminal proceedings, and then also helping them access resources that are available to them. So, for example, crime victims compensation, to address some of the financial hardships that victims face that go really a lot of times unaddressed.
Right. So. And we'll get into crime victims compensation before we're through, because that's a very important area that a lot of victims may not understand. Okay, now, we're going to talk about the article Time magazine had, which asked the question, do we live in a rape culture society, or is it time to get rid of the rape hysteria? And before we begin, I want to go over some of the things that have been going on that we've been sitting by as Americans and watching happen on TV right before our eyes. If you recall, NASCAR driver Kyle Busch was under investigation for domestic violence. He allegedly smashed his wife's face in the wall in one of their trailers and at the NASCAR race, and we haven't really heard anything about that except that happened once. Of course, we've all seen the Ray Rice video.
Right.
Sure.
And have kind of been shocked at that going on, and we know what happened afterwards regarding the NFL taking him off the list and not allowing him to work. So we'll talk about whether or not you think that's a viable remedy. Of course, the sexcapades of Bill Cosby cannot go unmentioned.
Correct.
I will say up front that he's only been adjudicated in a court of public opinion, not a criminal court.
Well said.
But we see every day there seems to be more and more women coming out from 20, 30, or 40 years ago talking about some type of sexual encounter with them, and we'll talk about that and possibly as to why a woman would even wait that long. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with comedian Artie Lang. He was the comedian who decided that he liked one of the African-American female sports announcers and decided to make a bunch of jokes about him being Thomas Jefferson and she being his sex slave, and he thought that was funny. Now, he went on to say if he hurt, the lady's name was Champion, Miss Champion's feelings, he would apologize to her. But he refused to make any type of apologies or say that he thought what he did was wrong. In fact, he said that he was not going to apologize to the politically incorrect attitude or culture that we have, because we seem to think everything is politically incorrect. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. But there's many other things, but one thing that I find particularly disturbing as we talk about whether or not we live in a culture of rape, and we're going to kind of broaden that topic to not just include rape, but violence against women.
Sure.
One thing that I find particularly disturbing is the new Grand Theft Auto video game. Have you heard about that game, Mona?
I know in the past, I have some past context for that, especially with just the imagery, and also I believe that there's a scenario in which the person that's playing the game can gain points if they beat females. I believe that there's like a female in there that's it's an incentive to be able to hurt or harm that woman that's in the game. So I found that particularly appalling, and it's aimed at a very young age as far as the game goes and who plays that. So yes, I have some context. I haven't heard anything about the new one. I'm honestly rather kind of
what
scared.
I've read about the new one is that the game actually allows you to simulate a rape scene in addition to all the other crimes that it allows you to do in the context of playing it. Now that is something else that you can assimilate. And so I'm going to start with you, Tammy, if I might call you Tammy.
Sure.
We go back a little bit. Mm-hmm. So we know each other a little bit. And you're a professional. You provide counseling to people who have been victimized in the area of sexual assault.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's just start with the broad issue of, do we have a hysteria or is it a rape culture? Do you think that some of the things that we've seen lately in the news leads credence to that thought that we do perhaps live in a rape culture?
I think it's a double-edged sword, if you will, Delia. We have where media puts that out there, and I think exacerbates it. It magnifies it, maybe not creating that, but certainly making it worse. At the same time, I think it is some desensitization there through the game that you mentioned. We're talking how young playing these games? Doesn't even matter, any age really. Mm-hmm. We've become desensitized where we don't even notice or are not as appalled as we once were, even 10 years ago, at some of the things that, and we've seen studies in the brain where you're actually living that out. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, I don't have statistics on it, but I wonder about the effects on certainly the number of rape cases, the number of murders even.
Now, Tammy, you and I might be a little bit closer in age range. You might remember a time when, I believe it was Ice-T, I don't want to get my ices mixed up. There's Ice-T and Ice Cube. When Ice-T came out with Cop Killer.
Definitely, yes.
And there was a national brouhaha about that song causing people to go out and kill cops.
Sure.
Do you think that perhaps that this would be likened to that same type of problem? Absolutely agree.
And I wonder if the brouhaha would be as big today.
Exactly. Well, Mona, we're not going to leave you out, because I know this is an area that you are very well versed in. You're working on your master's degree at this time, and as well as working with victims in this area. Let me give you a definition of what rape culture is. It was coined in the 1970s by feminists, and I'm not sure what that term really means anymore. I do like the way Beyonce brings it out, though. And it says rape culture is a term that was coined by feminists in the United States in the 1970s. It was designed to show the ways in which society blamed victims of sexual assault and normalized male sexual violence. To you, do you think we're just being, as Artie Lang said, just too politically correct when we talk about a rape culture or a society that's geared towards violence against women?
I don't. I think I agree with a lot of the sentiment that we've talked about here. I think that a lot of what we're dealing with today is perpetuated by the media, as far as the disempowerment, really, of women. And there are a lot of aspects, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that, in ways that our society is very victim blaming, which is one of those things that you mentioned about the definition of a rape culture. We see that in a lot of ways, in a lot of our, especially specifically in the area that I'm in with police and law enforcement, their response to victims. And so we see that a lot as far as victim blaming and the concept of this, really disempowering women and in that context, yeah.
Well, let's certainly not narrow this down when you mention the words victim blaming and empowerment. Recently, Ann Coulter has made statements regarding rape and whether or not she believes it even exists. Do you recall what those statements were?
Yeah, I think what she had mentioned was something in the context that rape didn't exist unless a woman was hit over the head with a brick, I believe. And so the way that I received that message, and this was again my reception of it, was to be that rape only exists in context of being physically harmed so much so that you're, I guess, incapacitated in a way, and maybe not able to physically respond. That's the way I received that.
Extreme.
And in my experience, the victims that I've worked with over the numerous years, many of my clients, yes, were physically harmed, but they were, subdued in other ways, restrained or choked or slapped or hit, in which, or use of drugs where they may not really have, they didn't have the context to really make a decision to have that sexual assault. It was against their consent. And so the context in which Ann Coulter is talking about is not, in my experience, the majority of the ways that sexual assaults occur. I feel like that's a misrepresentation of what our concept is of rape, and,
Well said.
Do you have any thoughts on her statements?
Well, and the first thing I think of after hearing those statements is, studies show that mental does as much damage to the brain and the psyche as physical does. So do we really need extreme physical? Mm-hmm. Just mental, which is never just.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Well, along that line, Tammy, mental, there is a lot of thought out, and we'll talk specifically. And again, I'm going to say that any of the accusations against Mr. Cosby have simply been the court of public opinion, has not been adjudicated
Sure.
in any type of criminal court. But let's just take that scenario of the fact that you have women coming forth 20, 30, even 40 years later. What do you attribute to someone who will say has been sexually assaulted, not necessarily in his case, but has been sexually assaulted, but is unwilling to come forward or will wait those many years? We do know statistically most rapes do not get reported. What do you attribute that to in terms of a victim not wanting to come forward?
A 5-letter word, shame. Shame, feeling responsible, and that's with an everyday person as your attacker. Taking on, just in this example, the likes of someone with the fame and notoriety and power would be especially daunting. But shame and the tendency to feel like I did something wrong, and let's look at society and how they contribute to that.
Right.
Maybe I was in the bar, maybe I did have a few drinks, maybe I was having a really good time. Maybe I just wanted to go hang out a little bit, but I didn't think it was going to end in something like that.
Right.
And feeling responsible for that. Not feeling like I'll be believed. There's a lot that goes on with that, and that's assuming they haven't had a history of being abused already, which again, magnifies it.
Right. And it's a fine line. Would you agree that there is sort of a continuum of violence that we as women experience maybe on a daily basis that starts with simply statements, remarks, like Miss Champion, who's simply trying to go to work and be a sports announcer, and now is broadcast all over internationally as the sex slave of some comedian, to touching, then progressively touching to the point of rape. There's sort of a continuum. Would you think that would be a fair statement of?
I do, and even in our lives, how often do we hear condescending remarks that are meant to degrade, even to the point where maybe we don't notice. It is part of the culture and accepted.
And as you mentioned earlier, we were talking about Ice-T and Cop Killer, and would we even be as shocked today with those type of lyrics as we were back in the early 90s with his type of lyrics? would you agree that that's sort of a development of the culturization of our society of sexualizing women? The
Yes.
fact that we become so insensitive to
Correct.
to things that seem as graphic?
Unless it's addressed toward our mothers and our sisters, it is tolerated.
Yes.
And I don't know that it's always noticed.
I was once told that men truly understand those kind of issues when they actually have daughters. And we're not to show that we're not saying men are only responsible for the culture that we live in.
Correct.
But we do have to start the conversation at some point. Now, you talked a little bit about victims and compensation. Before we specifically get into crime victims and Denton County Friends of the Family, I want to ask you another kind of general question.
Sure.
In terms of issues like with Ray Rice, when he was seen on TV knocking his fiance unconscious, who later became his wife, and then she penned a letter to the world saying, "Leave me alone." In situations like that, do we leave her alone?
It's a great question. I think that the way that we handle it in the field of working, victim advocacy is that we are receptive to what the victim's wishes are. Now, that being said, what we want to do is provide that person with information and not specific, general and all options about the pros and cons of all the different resources and options that, a victim does have available. But it is our, as our job also as a victim advocacy agency to be respectful of what the victim wants. And so in this case, she is demonstrating that she wants to be supportive of the relationship and so forth. And so our role would be to be supportive of her and her choice. One of the cons of not being supportive of a victim in their choice is that they are further isolated and don't feel like they have a resource to return to when or if they decide that relationship isn't what they want to be in. And so the statistics vary, and as far as they say that it's women or victims of violence leave a relationship and return to a relationship about 7 times before they leave for the last time. And again, those are kind of varying statistics, but we know for the most part, many victims of violence will stay in a relationship and return to a relationship. So if we don't support that victim in the choice, whatever that choice might be, we are in ourselves then isolating that victim further to only having her abuser.
Now, Tammy, you mentioned earlier that emotional and not just. You made that statement because it's emotional abuse. I like to call it scarred on the inside.
Well said.
And sometimes might even be worse because you can't even see it. So
Can't put a Band-Aid on it.
exactly, you don't get the benefit of someone who's been abused on the outside.
Correct.
The encouragement that they might get. In your experience, why would a person such as a Janae Rice, why would they stay in that type of relationship? Not that you have all the answers, but you've been through some of the things, some of the emotional things.
Well, Terrell Counseling has a few offices, and one of those is in Gainesville, and we work closely with Abigail's Arms, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
Absolutely.
We partner with them as well and get to experience this quite often. Why do they stay? I think you don't know until you know. And with this particular syndrome, which I'm sure Mona can speak more to, it is the level of the self-esteem, the denial, beginning to believe what your abuser says to you, which there's already usually an inherent low self-esteem there, so there's doubt there already. There's a whole nother syndrome with narcissism and those that work within the narcissistic system in relationships. I think the average, is it 7 that they leave before they stay gone? And that's...
Is that 7 years?
7 times that they leave without, before they finally, stay away. And all of the manipulation that happens, the victimization, it is so powerful, very, very powerful, very hard to get away from. And I hear often, why don't they just get out? What's wrong with them? Don't they know? It's not that clear. It is not that clear when you're in it. You're in the middle of a tornado and things are spinning around you and you can't see through it. and you start to believe what's being told to you on a daily basis.
Right.
And I don't know if that's an
emotional
answer. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's an answer, but it's kind of a glimpse into what they live in.
Did you want to add something to what she just said?
Yeah, and I would add that I think that the question that you started off with is why did she stay? I would ask, why is that person abusing? And I think that that's one of the first, kind of dialogue just for us as a community and as a society is to start our perception of what the problem is, right? Because in and of itself, that question, why is that person abusing, it starts a dialogue about who we need to hold accountable.
Well
and
said.
so that would be the first thing. As far as, that opens that dialogue and it shifts the perspective away from our victim blaming to really holding the perpetrator of the violence accountable, which then kind of segues into really addressing the problem, which is why is that person harming the other person? It's, that domination, the power and control.
Yes.
There's a lot of those different dynamics then, can start to be addressed and really triaged, because those are the reasons why victim stays, whether it be the finances, the physical violence, the emotional trauma, the verbal and emotional abuse, things of that nature.
Okay. Well, we've spoken kind of globally. We've talked about rape and victims, domestic violence on kind of a global thing. And I have one last kind of general question for the both of you. Then we'll talk specifically about some of the resources within Denton County. And that is financially. Holding perpetrators accountable financially, not simply through the criminal process system, but for instance, like with Ray Rice,
Right.
when he was suspended and not able to play, and some of the other things that he's not able to do because as a result of what we had seen on the video.
Sure.
We won't talk about whether or not we think the NFL really knew the legitimate
Right.
actions of what happens, but the issue of financially holding them accountable, do you think that beginning to do that on a larger scale would help to kind of bring down the culture of it being so acceptable?
I think that as a society, we should be open to exploring what other types of accountability. I think right now the primary form of accountability for perpetrators of violence is obviously the law, right? And we think a lot about jail time and probation and things of that nature. But I think that what the NFL and the Ray Rice situation did bring to light is what are some different forms of accountability, which at the end of the day, that's really the conversation that victims want to have, is how do we hold an offender accountable? And many times, how can that offender get help, right? A lot of our victims want their offenders to have help. And accountability financially, whether it be through a job, right, because you had a contract, there could be some value in that. I think it's worth exploring. I don't think that it's the only option that we should explore or that victims should have available. I think that they should be, I think victims should have a whole, be able to explore any and all options for accountability for offenders.
Okay. Tammy, do you think the financial aspect would help to change some of the tone that we're seeing in our culture?
I do believe that. I do believe it would help. Is it sufficient? No, just on its own. I believe that not only is, of course, I'm going to be a proponent of counseling and therapy, but not just therapy, not the feel good, is that how you feel therapy, the hardcore, between the eyes, holding them accountable, even when they try to dance out of that accountability, it has to be hard hitting.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to get to a segment where we're going to call our closing arguments, and I'm going to turn it over to Mona and let you talk some about crime victims counseling, Denton County Friends of the Family, and some other last thoughts that you would like the residents of Denton to know.
Sure. So Denton County Friends of the Family is our local agency that provides free services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, child sexual abuse, and we serve the entire Denton County population. And what we offer there is a variety of services. If a victim is seeking emergency shelter for a physical, imminent safety concerns, that's available. We also offer outreach services, including counseling, individual, group, children's play therapy that serve specifically the county and the area. A little bit more kind of, in my area, is the specialization in helping victims of crime, again, both domestic violence and sexual assault, navigate through the complex systems, whether that be through law enforcement, going with them to go meet with the detective and meet with the prosecutor, working through any civil remedies like protective orders, helping them with apply for crime victims compensation, which is a state of Texas resource. So it's available to all victims of crime that occurred in Texas. And those can be some financial remedies, for example, helping a sexual assault victim relocate if they were assaulted in their home. So we help them navigate through that process and help them get some tangible benefits, financial benefits that can help them transition and heal.
All right, and crime victims compensation is an important aspect. Tammy?
Well, Terrell Counseling has offices in Louisville, Denton, and Gainesville. We work closely with Friends of the Family, Abigail's Arms, MHMR, other institutions, agencies that deal with trauma. Many therapists who do anything from working with the children to the victims of trauma, and the main thing being that we walk with them through it in all ways and help get referrals legally, financially, down to the basics. And so we stay beside them, and I guess that's it.
Okay. And counseling is something that is really important, not only for the victim but the perpetrator. So
Absolutely.
It's a great resource.
Absolutely.
Either Denton County Friends of the Family or through Terrell Counseling. Well, I'm going to save the last part for what I call the final argument, and I'll take that myself. And that is whether or not we live in a rape culture society, or we call it that, it might be above my pay grade, really, to decide what that is. But what we do know today is that 1 in 4 college women will be assaulted. We do know that we have a media that sometimes will be more sympathetic to a teen perpetrator of sexual assault because of his lost future than the victim who might have been sexually assaulted. And we know that's a problem. We know that we live in a time where during a certain time period, more women died as a result of domestic violence than they did during the Afghanistan war. So that kind of sheds a light on how dangerous it could be to be a woman in one of those types of situations. I can't say whether or not the culture society is, it's a rape culture society, but I do know we have a problem and we need to address it. And it has gotten to the point where even the White House has taken actions and started a campaign called It's On Us to try to help reduce the amount of sexual assaults in the United States. So if you want to continue this conversation, you can continue it and you can go to Access, the number 2 Justice blog on WordPress.com. Leave us a comment and continue the conversation. Let us know what you think. Or you can contact us at parkerlegal@AOL and tell us some things you would like us to discuss on Access to Justice. I'm Delia Parker-Mims, and I want to thank Mona Muro for coming and Tammy Terrell for spending time with us and talking about this subject, even though it may be a little bit above our pay grade to come with a conclusion, but we know it's something that needs to be addressed.
Yes.
So for Access to Justice, thank you for watching. Good evening.